Okay, we are talking about faith in our foundations class. And so we kind of started last time with the Old Testament, just kind of seeing, right, the Israel's Jewish idea of faith. Not that it's different, it just worked differently. Because when a lot of times we talk about faith, we're talking about what we're saved by, right? And a lot of times we're in this salvation realm. And Israel wasn't necessarily thinking of salvation in the spiritual sense, right? Because oftentimes they're looking to be rescued physically, but they're not wanting to do what? They're not wanting to change spiritually. So they a lot of times associate faith with, is God going to save us as a people, right? As a nation, and keep His promises, land promise, temple, right? All those types of things. And as you go through the prophets, though, that changes a little bit, okay? Because now when you're living in captivity, outside the promise, outside all these things, what are you supposed to live by, right? And the righteous wait on the Lord. And so that concept kind of comes in. They trust on God's promises. But unfortunately, and the reason why I wanted to establish really heavily that all these different ideas and all these different descriptions of faith is because when we're talking with people, this becomes a point of contention when we're talking about salvation, right? Because if salvation is belief, well, one, belief in what? That's why I was asking, right? When you're saying you are saved by faith, what are you believing in? Is it a belief in God? Is it a belief that God can save? Is it a belief that God will save? Is it what define faith? And then when you start looking at a lot of these Old Testament examples, it gets way deeper than just a mental assent. And it starts hitting down into the trust and obedience part, okay? If it does not end with trust and obedience to complete faith, it's not like faith and obedience, it's faithful obedience, right? You know, and that's different, isn't it? Right? I have faith, I'm saved, then I obey, right? Or faith that saves is faith that will obey. And to me, those are two different directions, because a faith that thinks they need to be saved before they obey, right? Well, we'll get into James 2 in a little bit. It's a faith that's useless, right? A faith that only obeys when it's saved is really shallow, right? It's kind of like love that only loves when it's loved first, right? Faith that obeys only when they see the promises first is really not faith at all. And that's the whole book of Hebrews 11 is all about. By faith, a lot of these people did things without ever seeing. They had hope. They had trust, right? And so faith, obedience, all these things kind of come together. Now, the Bible will sometimes differentiate them too. And usually when it's comparing the two, it's the difference between someone who's trying to be saved by obedience alone, right, without faith, okay? And then that takes on a whole new realm, and we'll get there. I'm hoping to get there next week, okay? So, Romans 10, someone read Romans 10:17. We want to start kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of some of these things. I do. And while you read it, I'm really going to need a water tonight, so I'm going to go get myself a water bottle from the fridge as you're... Huh? You got it? You don't want it over here?
Want me to read it?
Yeah.
All right, Romans 10:17.
Yes.
So faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ.
And then read the next verse as well.
But I ask, have they not heard? Indeed they have, for the voice has gone out to all the earth, and the words to the ends of the world.
Okay. So first, we're going to talk about this idea of faith. Faith comes by hearing. And I find that interesting because what are we hearing? What are we hearing? In context, what are we hearing? How can we believe in him? Right? So there's a specific hearing, right? Because there are many people who heard the voice of God. Sometimes literally, through a cloud, through a fire, through other means, they heard, or through a donkey, right? Heard the voice of God, but they would not what? They would not trust, they would not follow, they would not obey. And the Bible would say they did not have faith, okay? So it's not about belief, it's about belief in a something, right? There's a someone as well, but hearing the word of Christ or hearing the word of God. Now, when you take that, hearing the word of Christ, what words of Christ do they need to hear, right? And that kind of gets into how much does someone need to know before they're saved. But in the context of Romans chapter 10, we did this probably about 5 weeks ago. My wonderful wife, who's watching online, asked a good question about Romans 10, and we kind of went through the context. Paul is writing about Jews who have not believed in Jesus, right? They believe in the law, they put their trust in the law, right? They have a faith in God, right? Go back to chapter 10. Verse 1, it says, "Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved, for I bear them witness that they have a zeal for God, but not according to knowledge. For being ignorant of the righteousness of God and seeking to establish their own, they did not submit to God's righteousness, for Christ is the end," or literally the goal of the law, "for righteousness to everyone who believes." And so when we're talking about the words of Christ, we need to realize that even the Old Testament is a part of that. That entire storyline, that story of redemption, right, starting from Genesis, leading us to the goal, the end, which is Christ, and the final thing that someone must believe in is Jesus. But there's a whole lot before Jesus that needs to be talked about, right? It's kind of like, let's say you went over, this is a really bad example, in a movie I do not recommend you watch, okay? It's a movie from Ace Ventura, When Nature Calls, okay? And they're over in an African village, and they basically say they did not know sickness until the white man came, right? And then he pretends to sneeze on them jokingly. But that's the point. Like, it'd be like going over to an African village that doesn't deal with disease the way we do because of the things that we eat and do, and go, "Hey, I've got a doctor who's going to cure you from cancer." And they go, "What's cancer?" And you just start there rather than have to explain, here's what cancer is, here's what it can do to your body, and if it's not impacting them in any way, it means nothing to them, right? So a part of about talking about the hope of the world is also letting them know about the sickness of the world. In the Old Testament is a vast history of the sickness of even people that God chooses, handpicked right out of the world, gives them special promises and special privileges and special, protection, and even they fail. Right? And so there's this whole storyline that builds up. And Paul says, hey, they've got a lot of the part right, but they miss who? They miss Christ. So this faith is in a system of righteousness that God has established from the beginning. And that system of righteousness has always been, they have been saved by faith. Now that faith led them to do a whole lot of things, and that's what Hebrews 11 tells about, right? By faith Abel, by faith Abraham, by faith Sarah, by faith Noah, by faith all these prophets of old did something. Okay, it caused them to act. It caused them to respond to God in some way. So, going back to Romans chapter 10, so faith comes from hearing. This is not some vision you get, all of a sudden God tells you He's real and you believe. This is not even, I would go so far to say, this is not a one conversation you have with somebody and boom, right? And you start with Jesus. unfortunately, what we miss when we read our New Testaments, well, look how fast they were converting people. They were converting people who were primed for the gospel. Where'd they go first? They went to Jews. But if you see, as Paul goes throughout his missionary journeys, as he goes through more Gentile-heavy cities, what does he do? He stays there a lot longer. Why? Because he's got to teach them a whole lot of information that these Jews in Jerusalem, when he starts saying, hey, the Messiah has come, they're not going, who? They've already, all of their feasts, all of their festivals, all their morning prayers, all the passages that they have memorized, they've been waiting for the Messiah, this Jesus whom you crucified. A lot of them were there for the event. And if they weren't there in person, they knew somebody who was there. Okay? So there's a lot of work, but as you get away from that, Jerusalem, and you go out into Samaria, and you start heading yourselves out to the uttermost parts of the earth in Acts chapter 1, Paul's got to, I'm going to sit in Corinth for a while. I'm going to sit here for 3, he's there for over a year. Why? There's some work to do, right? Even in Thessalonica, he was there for 3 weeks. He would have stayed longer. It was mostly Gentiles. But for 3 weeks, he was preaching, okay? But even then, they had some Jewish influence to kind of go off of. So faith, if we're going to have, that's cool. If we're going to get people to believe, and we're going to talk about faith, faith has to be more than belief. Because our definition of belief is, do I believe something? Do I believe it's true? You can believe it's true all you want. But until you reach a level of faith that will save you, and that's the difference. There's a faith that saves, and there's a faith that doesn't. Okay? There's a faith that saves, and there's a faith that doesn't. What distinguishes? It's how you respond to the story of Jesus from start to end. Okay? All right. Let's go to Galatians chapter 5, and let's kind of fill some of this stuff in. Any questions on that, by the way? Does that make sense, though, when you're talking to someone? Because a lot of times we start getting into baptism, arguments, or we start getting the baptism discussions. We start having to argue baptism versus faith. And what we need to be doing is showing how baptism and faith go together. You cannot have one without the other, right? Baptism, and what we're going to get to, hopefully after faith, we're going to be talking about baptism. Baptism is that sign act. That sign act that shows that I'm now at that level of faith where I'm willing and I'm ready not just to trust God, but to follow Him no matter where, right? Baptism is that final sign act that tells you, God, and everybody else, kind of like that Abraham moment we talked about, now I know you fear me. Right? It's that moment where you can declare. That's why when Paul in Romans chapter 6, he's never met anybody in Rome, by the way. He never met them. He did not establish the church at Rome. And what does he say? All of us who were baptized into Christ were baptized into His death. How can he assume that? He can assume that because they're all Christians. And if they're all Christians, what must they have done to declare that? All right? That's kind of that leading step. All right. So who wants to read Galatians 5? And I want you to read verses 1 through 6. Who wants to read it? We got mics. Levi? Oh, we got.
Okay.
I'll get you on the next one, Levi.
For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not submit again to a yoke of slavery. Look, I, Paul, say to you that if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. I testify again to every man who accepts circumcision that he is obligated to keep the whole law. You are severed from Christ. You who would be justified by the law, you have fallen away from grace. For through the Spirit, by faith, we ourselves eagerly wait for the hope of righteousness.
Read one more passage.
For in Christ Jesus, neither circumcision nor uncircumcision counts for anything, but only faith working through love.
Okay, so now we've got faith that is doing what? Working through love. What does that mean? He says nothing else matters. And by the way, these kinds of statements are made all over Scripture, and they don't perfectly line up. So usually it's a specific context that he's trying to drill a point home. We can't, like earlier in chapter 5, look what he says. It kind of goes together, but in verse 14 of chapter 5, he goes, "For the whole law is fulfilled in one word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself." All of these different ideas, faith, love, grace, properly understood with their totality, you can summarize the entire gospel with the word grace, if you define it right. You can summarize the entire gospel with faith, if you define it right. You can summarize the entire gospel with the word love, if you define it right, because grace, hope, love, right, works, all of them actually go together, and they should be in every single one of our conversations about grace, about works, about love, about faith, okay? So, but faith working through love, what does that mean? What are some things that come up in your head?
You're not working to earn something. You're working because someone has already done something for you, and your love for them causes you to act.
Yeah, so this key word, through, right, means there's a lens, there's something that has happened that is causing something, right? Now, you could easily say faith working through the gospel here, or working through grace, because they all kind of come together, but love becomes a defining characteristic of disciples, right? Because the two greatest commands, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, love your neighbor as yourself, and from the whole law, right? All of the law and the prophets hang from those two commands. Anything God has ever asked us to do either has a love of God aspect to it or a love of neighbor aspect to it, right? And oftentimes, it's not just one or the other, it's both. Right? And that's what John brings up. You can't claim to love God if you're not willing to love your neighbor. You actually show us that you love God by loving your brother, right? Or neighbor. Right? John just happens to be talking about Christians coming together and working, but the concept is the same. But this idea of working, why do we get so scared of that word when we're talking about faith?
A large part of it is because so many people think that they have to work their way to heaven. So we're afraid that we will be seen as teaching that.
Yeah, and Daniel White's not in here. Me and him, basically, he's still working on this guy, and he's actually made huge progress their last conversations. I thought the guy, you always, shake the dust off and walk away, but sometimes they walk back in kind of thing. I spent 3 years studying with this person just trying to convince him that baptism is not a work the way he thinks about it, okay? And he finally is like, oh, I see it. It's like, Don?
Yeah, and on the converse of that.
Here, let's get a mic.
And on the converse of that, we don't want to be seen as working our salvation.
Yeah.
You're not saved through works.
Yeah, you don't want to be, and that's the balance, right? That's why they need to be worked together. Faith and works need to come together. You don't work your salvation, but your works done through faith allow God to do what? Save. God's always the one doing the saving, okay? And this is, jump over to Galatians 2 real quick, or Colossians 2. And I think this is probably the most vivid picture of what this looks like. Verse 11 says, in him also you were, this is Colossians 2, in him also you were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands. Now that made without hands is a key biblical theme. You can go all the way back to Daniel chapter 2, a kingdom made without hands, meaning it is done, something is done that is not done by humans, it's done by divine. Okay, it's a divine act. Made without hands by putting off the body of flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised with him through faith in the powerful working of whom? In the powerful working of God who raised him from the dead. So even in our faith working through love, the power that is saving us is not us meriting or earning or God going, well, I guess I got to do it. You know, I'm obligated to do it. They've met check mark 1, 2, 3. Right? It's a trust that when we go down in the water and we come up out of the water, nothing we just did saved us, right? Hopefully all of us take showers on the regular. I like to take my baths, right? It's my at least 3 times a week ritual. I've got a big bathtub, made sure I had that in my house. I know, you know, some people make fun of me, but it's my zen, okay? I even have bath bombs, men bath bombs that I buy, you know, essential oil. It's my way. But I fully submerge myself 3 times a week. Nowhere in there do I believe, you know, that every time I do that, God has to look down and say, well, I got to save him again. I got to save him again just because I went through some ritual. It's a faith working through love, right? You have faith, a trust in God, right? You're responding to the love of God, and when you trust, faithfully obey him, you're trusting and hoping and believing. By this hope, we don't mean like wishful thinking, like when you scratch the lottery ticket hope, sure and steadfast, because God is a keeper of his promises, that it's the powerful working of God that saves us. Okay? God is the one who saves. And it is it is comically often illustrated in Old Testament stories. And the one that's the best kid's story to illustrate this is the marching around Jericho. There's nothing in what Israel did that would naturally cause those walls to fall down. They could have done that 100 times. 100 days in a row, and they're not moving the earth enough, they're not shaking the earth enough, you know, hitting the right weak points of the wall by walking in a circle, and then they shouted the trumpet so loud, you know, it reminds you of the Harry Potter movie where she, you know, screams to try to break the glass and she's got to slam it against the, you know, nothing they would have done is going to cause that, no matter how often they did that, besides what? The powerful working of God. That's faith. Even if he tells you to do something silly, you do it because you trust. If you're not willing to do it, you can't claim to do what? Have faith. That is why the action completes the faith. It's the completing of it, right? Because until you actually follow through with it, you can't prove and show that you're willing. I remember we had a graveyard that was supposed to be haunted. You know, everyone's got their graveyards that are haunted growing up in their hometowns. And we all decided that we were going to go and walk through this, and there's like a little shack kind of in the middle of it that's run down. Technically, we've come to find out there's actually a grave in this shack. It wasn't just like a... you know, like where they kept the brooms and such. And so we all decided to go. We all had the courage. We're going to do it. We're going to show everybody. Show up to the graveyard. You know how many of us walked through that graveyard that night? Not a one. We had that courage all the way up, and we talked about it. Oh, we're going to do it, it's all this. But we wouldn't step through. We wouldn't set foot on the grounds. I still sometimes when I drive by a graveyard do this. You ever do that? You never know that? Like if you drive by a graveyard, you got to hold your breath so a spirit doesn't come in? What? Okay, well, I grew up, someone told me that somewhere along the way when I grew up, that if you drive by a graveyard, you got to close your mouth so a spirit doesn't come in. Keep that to yourself. Well, I'm telling you what my foolish fears. Anyway, faith working through love. Okay? And Paul says that's the only thing that matters. That's the only thing that matters is faith working through love. Now, in context, he's speaking about working the works righteousness of the law, going back to circumcision, right? Or following through with what Jesus has fulfilled and completed through the law. Now, a lot of the things that you would do under the law are a lot of the things you would do as a Christian. Because God doesn't change. He still expects the same behavior. But what he does not want is for you to think you're earning your salvation and meriting your salvation through your faith, right? You are being gifted it through your faith. Salvation is still a gift. And that's a part of the faith, is believing that it is a gift. Okay? If we end up, let's just throw the hypothetical out there. If all of us end up in hell one day, we can't say, well, God, I did this. That's not what you would say. You would say, but God, you promised this. And that's the only accusation we could bring. Not that we deserved to be in heaven, but that he promised that we'd be there. And you see the difference between those two accusations? That's why when in Hebrews chapter 10, when he says, when we go before the throne, we can go in boldness based upon his blood and his promise and his sacrifice, not our own merit. Okay? So faith has to kind of bring all that together. All right. Someone else read Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 8. Hebrews 11, verse 8. That's it right there. Not knowing where you're going, don't know the end result. You just trust the person who's telling you to go. That's faith. That's hard for us, isn't it? How many of you like to know where you're going? How many of you want to know the path, the exact path you are going? How many of you are weird like me that even want to know where you're going to stop on that path when you're going? No one else? I like to, if it's the same trip, I like to stop at the same stops I've always stopped at because I'm familiar with them and I like them, right? I'm struggling this time because we're going to go back to New York for Thanksgiving and I'm taking an RV and we're planning not to stop. And, I don't know where you can stop with an RV. I'm getting all nervous just not knowing what gas station I can fill up an RV at, okay? You know them?
Stop at any truck stop.
Any truck stop? Well, see, now my faith is just, calm my nerves. All right, someone else read Romans 4. Well, actually, we're going to skip that. It's just another Abraham thing. Here's what I really want to get into. What happens when we wrestle with our faith? Someone read Job 13:15. Job 13:15. Job, hey, you know what? You can read Job 13:15 and 42:7. I know. I'm gracious tonight.
Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even so, I will defend my own ways before him.
All right, read it one more time.
What?
I know.
Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. Even so, I will defend my own ways before him.
So this is Job talking about God. Even though he would kill me, I will still defend my ways. You see the irony here? Right? I am, and Job's being stubborn here a little bit. I am going to defend that I did nothing wrong. Even if he kills me, I'm defending my faith, or I'm defending my life. Now read Job 42:7. This is God speaking to Job's friends.
And so it was, after the Lord had spoken these words to Job, that the Lord said to Eliphaz the Temanite, My wrath is aroused against you and your two friends, for you have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has.
Okay, and I just called out one of the passages where Job challenged God a little bit and kind of had this kind of unfair spout against God. He never cursed God, right, going all the way back to Job. But he did doubt. He did not know why. And God did have to take him kind of, okay, you want to know? I'm not going to tell you, but let me show you a little bit of perspective. I keep the universe in place. I'm the one who's the master over the Leviathan, the deep sea creatures. Everything that functions is because I function. Do you not think that I can't handle a problem? And Job doesn't know what happens. He repents. He falls down. But I just love what God says about Job. God was okay with Job's growth process in his faith. God was okay. Everything Job did up to the repenting, right? This faith finally led him to less of self and more of God, but along that process is still faith. So faith isn't perfect. Faith is something that can grow and be added to, right? Add to your faith, virtue knowledge, right? It is something that needs to grow, develop, mold, but any point along the way, you are considered to have been having faith. If you go and you look at the life of Abraham, did he have faith in Genesis 12? Did he have faith in Genesis 22? Was he saved the entire way along from 15 to 22? What was the difference between 15 or chapter 12 and 22? It grew. Right? It grew to a point where God then told Abraham, now I know anything that I ask you, you will do it. Right? But the New Testament points out Job had faith when he was told to go too. He also had faith when he believed that God would give him a child. Different points, but different levels, different growth areas in our life. That's why a lot of times we look back, right, as you become a Christian and you're like, man, I was not the best Christian. I had moments of struggle. I had moments of weakness. You are who you are because of those moments of weakness, I guarantee it. You are who you are because you went through those struggles, because you went through those battles, and hopefully you overcame them. The problem comes in is when your doubt does not cause you to grow closer to God, it causes you to grow away from God. So Matthew 14 is Peter on the water, right? Peter stepped out on the water in faith. He saw the storms around him. His faith became weak. Jesus still did what though? Reached his hand down and pulled him up. Okay? God's still wanting to rescue. Is that the first bell? All right. So one person go to Psalm 106:24, and someone else go to Deuteronomy 1:31 through 32, and that's probably all we'll be able to get through tonight. Maybe Hebrews 3. Psalm 106:24. They despised the land, and they did not believe his word. Now, this is going to reference us back to a time in Israel's history. Someone read Deuteronomy 1, 31 and 32. Who wants the mic? Anyone? Huh? I'll do it. All right, Stella. Let me get you a mic real quick. That's all right. It's in the Old Testament. Deuteronomy 1, 31 and 32.
Okay. And in the wilderness where you have seen how the Lord your God carried you, as a man carries his son, all the way that you went until you came to this place. Yet in spite of this word, you did not believe the Lord your God.
So you see that? Even though you saw God carry you out of this place, they believed in who? That there was a God. They witnessed it. They were there for it. Okay? But then in verse 32, it says, yet in spite of this word, you did not believe the Lord your God. The believing has nothing to do with did they think he existed. It was, were they willing to listen? Right? Hear, O Israel. He who has ears, let him hear what the Lord has to say. That's the constant push of faith. Faith is a response to hearing. And when you don't respond to the hearing, which is the Word of God, and you don't allow it to help you grow, you don't have biblical saving faith. Okay? You may have a form of faith, but even the demons believe and shudder. Okay? That is not a faith that causes them to follow and to obey and to trust. Make sense? All right, we do have time for if someone wants to read Hebrews 3:18 through 19. The Hebrew author reiterates this, and in this context, it's a powerful passage to consider.
And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, but to those who were disobedient? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief.
Wait, were they not able to enter because of disobedience or unbelief? Yes. Unbelief is equated to disobedience, okay, in Scripture. Unbelief and disobedience is the same thing. So if you reverse that, what is faith equated to? Faith and the willingness to obey. Okay? Not earn, but it's a trusting obedience. It's a trusting faith. That if God said, hey, walk through this fire and I promise you won't be scorched, who's willing to do it? Right? Go into this lion's den and sleep there all night. Who's willing to have the faith that God will save him? Well, Daniel did, right? His friends did. That's the kind of faith that we're talking about. But this is where it gets a little tricky. Let's say Daniel decided to listen to the law that was put in place and to stop praying to his God. What would he be considered? Disobedient, which is equated to being an unbeliever. When we disobey, we are showing in that moment our unbelief. Which is why when the disciples are having a discussion with Jesus about forgiveness, what do they pray? Lord, help our unbelief. Not our disobedience, but it's the same term. So I'm saying that Greek and Hebrew term has so much more to do than with thought, but it has just as much to do with action in what we do as it is of what we believe. Okay? Because you can believe something, and have you ever been disappointed in yourself for not doing the right thing? Like when you know to do right and you don't do it, the Bible calls that sin because you're living in a moment of unbelief. So faith is so much more, right? It's a foundational principle that sometimes we just don't understand because we get caught up in the faith versus baptism discussion. When you look at this word, it becomes richer and more meaningful and not just so, nuanced. So when someone says, I believe we are saved by faith alone, yes, if it's biblical faith alone. Because that's going to include everything else we've been talking about. Okay? All right. We'll do some more next week. And hopefully conclude faith next week and work our way into baptism. And I'm really excited for that one because that's going to be more than just the baptism versus faith discussion. Okay? It's going to start from Genesis 1 this concept of water, salvation, purification. We're going to look at all of it. It's going to be, I hope, hopefully cool. I'll like it.